He smiled. Not a friendly, warm smile, but the kind that chills the blood, that fractures reality for anyone who dares to meet it. His own son, trembling, knelt before him, hands raised in desperation, eyes wide with the raw terror of a boy who suddenly realizes his father is not just a man, but a farce. History has long softened this moment, draping it in crown and court tales. But the truth is far darker. This was a king who understood power not as protection, but as control. And he wielded it like a blade, precise, cold, and unflinching. Imagine the chamber. High, echoing ceilings, tapestries depicting victories soaked in blood, the scent of wax and fear thick in the air. Courtiers froze in silence, knowing to breathe was almost a betrayal. Every eye was on the boy, every whisper suppressed. And the king, he smiled, as if the very panic twisting his son's face was a gift offered to him personally. That smile was a statement. Mercy is a currency, and it is mine to distribute. But why? Why would a father, a sovereign, relish the torment of his own blood? This is the part history leaves out. Behind the gold and velvet, behind the treaties and coronations, lies a calculus of power so ruthless it shapes dynasties, destroys empires, and bends reality itself. The king had studied men, yes, but the boy represented something deeper. A mirror, a threat, a reminder of mortality. In that moment, the king wasn't just a man wielding authority. He was an apex predator demonstrating the anatomy of fear. And there, in that silence, truth begins to seep. Fear is not just emotion, it is education. It is the teacher of obedience, the sculptor of loyalty, the architect of legacies built not on love, but on submission. And the boy, he would learn that lesson with every heartbeat, every breath, until the echo of that smile haunted him long after the crown had passed. History has hidden such moments because they are dangerous. Dangerous because they illuminate the hidden patterns behind power. The chambers of kings are not halls of glory. They are laboratories of control, theaters of psychological mastery, arenas where the strongest wills are tested against the weakest, and sometimes the weakest are forged into monsters themselves. Tonight, you will walk with me into one of these chambers. Not as an observer, not as a tourist, but as someone willing to see the machinery of dominance, the architecture of cruelty, and the truths no one in the history books dares to whisper aloud. And when we emerge, if we emerge, you will never look at power, or your own place in the world, the same way again. Power is not what you think. It is not titles, crowns, or armies. True power is the ability to bend perception itself, to make another man question reality, morality, even his own worth. This king understood it better than anyone. His smile, that cold, calculated gesture, was the outward signal of an inward mastery. He had learned to see fear as a tool, desire as a lever, and loyalty as a chain. And he tested it relentlessly, beginning with his son. The boy had been raised in luxury, tutored in diplomacy, trained in strategy, but all that mattered to his father was obedience. Every lesson in swordplay, every lesson in rhetoric, was laced with a hidden test. Could the child endure the weight of fear? Could he obey even when instinct screamed to flee? That was the true inheritance. Not lands, not gold, not armies, but the capacity to survive the silent, invisible war of control waged by those who hold absolute authority. Imagine standing there, knees weak, heart pounding, while the man who gave you life stares at you with no compassion in his eyes. You are a pawn, a reflection, a canvas for his experiments. And yet, there is a perverse elegance to it. The king moves like a conductor, orchestrating terror, watching it ripple through the room, noting every micro-expression, every involuntary tremor. He does not strike. He does not even speak. His power is in the pause, the expectation, the invisible weight pressing down on every soul present. History whispers of kings who were cruel, tyrannical. But this is different. This is methodical, precise. It is a study of the human mind, and the human will, and how both can be shaped, broken, and remade in the image of the ruler. And in that silence, the boy begins to internalize the most dangerous lesson of all, that submission is survival, and defiance is annihilation. He does not yet know it, but he is being forged in fire, not by flames, but by the cold architecture of fear. By the time the world sees the crown, the smile, the ceremonial grandeur, the lesson will already be complete. The boy, molded by terror, will step into the world carrying a shadow of his father's mind. And the king, he will continue, smiling at every act of submission, every bending of will, until his dominion is not just over kingdoms, but over hearts and minds alike. And now, consider this. What if the institutions we trust, the systems we obey, the men we call leaders, are nothing more than chambers like this? Chambers where obedience is cultivated, fear is refined, and loyalty is bought not with love, but with the mastery of invisible chains? You are about to see the pattern behind history. You are about to see what no one else is willing to show you. Power thrives in ritual, not the ceremonial kind you read about in dusty history books, the grand feasts, the waving banners, the oaths before nobles, but private, hidden rituals designed to bend the human soul. The king's chambers were laboratories of obedience. Every gesture, every phrase, every pause had a purpose. His smile was one weapon, silence another. And in that silence, he observed, catalogued, and manipulated every reaction like a master chess player anticipating moves decades ahead. The boy, desperate, thought he could bargain, reason, or appeal to mercy. But this king understood something fundamental. The mind that bends to fear is more pliable than any mind taught with kindness. The instruments of control were subtle: timing, body language, attention. A raised eyebrow at the wrong moment, a sigh that hinted at disappointment, a delay in granting the simplest favor. These were not accidents. They were deliberate, carefully engineered shocks designed to fracture confidence, instill doubt, and teach the young heir that the world itself was a landscape of peril, navigable only through vigilance and obedience. And yet, there was artistry here. The king's cruelty was never mindless. It was deliberate, almost surgical. He built patterns into daily life. Small humiliations, whispered expectations, cryptic instructions that seemed arbitrary but always tested loyalty. Courtiers learned quickly that their own survival depended on reading the invisible script, reacting to imperceptible cues, and anticipating the king's next move before he even made it. This was psychological architecture at its purest, a system that molded minds as surely as a sculptor molds clay, shaping behavior, thought, and even emotion to conform to a single standard: his will. History hides these methods, of course. Too dangerous to reveal. Because if men understood the mechanics of manipulation, they might begin to resist. And the king knew this instinctively. He spread lessons through fear, disguised them as traditions, embedded them into every interaction. By the time the boy emerged into adulthood, he had internalized the structure of power so deeply that he would replicate it without ever questioning its cruelty. The chain had passed from father to son, not forged in blood alone, but in psychological mastery so absolute it left no room for empathy, only obedience. And here's the lesson hidden in plain sight. Kingdoms fall, dynasties crumble, but the architecture of control remains. It migrates, shifts, adapts. Today, it wears new faces, new institutions, new guises, but the mechanisms are identical. The kings may no longer wield swords, but they wield fear, expectation, and invisible chains that bind men before they even realize they are shackled. You are watching history not to admire it, but to awaken, to see the systems at play before they shape your life. The boy's mind was a battlefield. Every day, he wrestled with terror and reason, instinct and instruction, desire and survival. Imagine the weight of knowing that a single misstep could invoke the king's smile, the smile that promised pain, humiliation, or worse. It was a calculus of fear, a ledger where every thought, hesitation, and heartbeat was accounted for. And as he grew, the line between obedience and self-erasure blurred. The boy began to see the world not as a place of possibility, but as a network of invisible traps, each controlled by forces far older and more patient than he could comprehend. Isolation was part of the design. Courtiers and tutors watched, but they were secondary instruments, extensions of the king's will. Friends became mirrors of authority, not allies. Every conversation, every interaction, reinforced the hierarchy. The boy learned to read micro-expressions, anticipate the unseen, and hide the truth of his own emotions. Empathy became a liability, vulnerability a weapon used against him. And in this crucible, he began to internalize the king's methodology, not through understanding, but through survival. Fear became instinct, obedience, reflex. And yet, beneath the surface, a spark of resistance remained, a whisper that refused to be extinguished. But resistance came at a cost. Every act of defiance, no matter how subtle, carried consequences. A raised eyebrow, a hesitated word, a faltering gesture. They were catalogued, remembered, stored for later examination. The king's smile would return, and with it the lesson: every mind can be bent, every soul tested, every human spirit dissected and reshaped. The boy understood this intuitively, long before he could articulate it. Pain became a language, fear a tutor, and the king. He was both master and mirror, reflecting the young man's weaknesses back at him with surgical precision. This is where history deceives us. It tells of the king and son, of crowns passed and battles won, but it leaves out the invisible wars waged in quiet chambers, in whispered glances, in microseconds of hesitation. These wars forge men, or break them. They are lessons hidden beneath pageantry, invisible to the casual observer, yet they determine the trajectory of entire dynasties. The boy, though outwardly compliant, carried within him the weight of these lessons, the imprint of fear so deep it would shape his decisions, his judgments, his morality, for the rest of his life. And now, consider this: the same patterns exist today. Institutions, leaders, systems, they all use subtle, invisible mechanisms to shape thought, behavior, and loyalty. Understanding them is not merely curiosity, it is survival. Watch closely, and you will see the architecture of control everywhere. And soon, you will begin to see it in yourself. Power is never exercised without purpose. Every cruelty, every manipulation, every calculated pause in the king's chambers served a hidden agenda far beyond the immediate moment. On the surface, it may have seemed like a tyrant tormenting his son, but underneath, it was strategy, a blueprint for domination that stretched across generations. The boy's suffering was not arbitrary. It was an investment, a seed planted to yield loyalty, faith, and ultimately, unbroken control. The king understood that true power lies in shaping perception before action. He was less concerned with swords and armies than with minds, his own, his son's, and those of the court. To control perception is to control reality. A man who doubts his own judgment is easier to manipulate. A son who fears the judgment of his father is more predictable than any general. The king's smile, that haunting expression, was a tool to remind the boy, I see you. I know your thoughts. I can bend your will before you even recognize it. And in that bending, power is absolute. History has hidden these lessons because they are dangerous knowledge. Institutions today, corporations, governments, religious hierarchies, they all function with the same architecture. Fear disguised as respect, obedience dressed as honor. Subtle, invisible levers that dictate behavior, shape thought, and manipulate identity. The king was not unique. He was a master of an ancient system, one passed down in shadows, whispered through generations. Every action, every smile, every pause, was a thread in the fabric of control. And the boy, he became both victim and he internalized the rules of domination so deeply that, once he assumed authority, he could replicate the same mechanisms with precision. The cycle of power, cruelty, and submission was complete. But there's more than dynasty at stake here. There's psychology, strategy, and the hidden anatomy of influence. Once you understand it, you begin to see the invisible chains in your own life. Now, I want you to do something. In the comments below, type this phrase twice. I see the chains. Not once, twice. Let the act itself anchor the recognition, the identity shift, the awareness of systems that operate unseen. This is not ritual, it is acknowledgement. It is the first step toward clarity. The king's smile was an initiation, a test. And by recognizing the chains, you begin your own initiation. Fear is not an accident. It is designed, engineered, and delivered with precision. The king understood this as no one else did. His smile, his silence, the timing of a word, all were instruments, calibrated to fracture the mind and reshape it in his image. He did not merely rule, he conducted experiments, testing the limits of endurance, measuring responses, cataloging weaknesses. And the boy, trembling under the weight of inherited expectation, was his primary subject. Imagine being watched constantly, your every thought and hesitation observed, analyzed, and used against you. The boy could not escape. There were no corners untouched by authority, no private recesses beyond the king's gaze. Cortes acted as extensions of that gaze, subtle enforcers, whispers in the hallways, reminders that every moment of defiance was being logged. And yet, the king never struck randomly. His cruelty was methodical, ritualized, and surgical. Each act reinforced the principle: dominance is aimed, understood, and internalized. The king also wielded rewards like weapons. Mercy, approval, attention. These were not kindnesses. They were levers. A nod, a word of praise, a passing glance could unmoor the boy, create hope, then crush it again. In this ebb and flow, the mind learns its place. Desire becomes submission. Aspiration becomes obedience. The instruments of fear are invisible, yet they penetrate every fiber of being. They are lessons without lectures, punishments without blows, power without question. History rarely tells you that the mechanics of control are more devastating than physical violence. They are quieter, subtler, but permanent. A single moment under that smile could leave scars invisible to the eye but indelible in the mind. And the boy, absorbing each subtle signal, each shadowed instruction, began to encode the rules of domination deep within himself. He was learning to anticipate, to perform, to exist within the architecture of authority. But at what cost? The soul learns to bend, the heart learns to silence itself. Now, reflect. Every institution you trust, every hierarchy you follow, functions on these same principles. Fear, reward, expectation, invisibility. The king's methods were extreme, but they are not unique, they are amplified. Recognizing them is the first step to reclaiming autonomy, the first step to seeing beyond the ritual, beyond the smile, beyond the invisible chains that bind most men without their consent. The architecture of control is everywhere, and it begins with seeing it. What drives a man to smile at the terror of his own son? History offers convenient explanations: madness, cruelty, ambition, but none capture the full measure of intent. This king operated on a level beyond conventional morality. His cruelty was never random. It was an expression of strategy, an articulation of dominance, and a meticulous shaping of legacy. The smile was a symbol, a cipher. It said, "I am absolute, and you exist at my discretion." Behind the smile lay a calculus few could grasp. Every act of terror, every moment of humiliation, was intended to forge a particular outcome. The boy was being trained not merely to survive, but to inherit the machinery of control intact. The father knew that power without comprehension is unstable. The son, weakened by fear yet sharpened by observation, would eventually internalize the methods that had subjugated him. The smile was a lesson in visibility and invisibility, a code written in expression and silence alike. The king's motives extended beyond the familial sphere. He understood that dynasties are fragile, that loyalty is fleeting, and that institutions crumble under mismanagement or indecision. By instilling terror, by teaching submission, he was embedding a system of self-perpetuating control. Fear, once learned, becomes a tool. Obedience, once internalized, is instinct. And when the boy inherited authority, he would do so already armed with the architecture of domination, a perfect instrument of legacy and continuity. But there was also a personal element, one that history rarely mentions. The king sought to test himself, to measure the boundaries of influence. Power, in its truest form, is as much about the ruler as the ruled. To see another tremble under your gaze, to manipulate without physical violence, to bend the human spirit using only calculation, that is mastery. And mastery is intoxicating. The smile, the silent command, the invisible chains, they were all part of his proof that he could conquer not just kingdoms, but hearts and minds. Look closely, and you begin to see echoes of this same system everywhere. Modern leaders, corporations, institutions, they operate under the same principles: control perception, shape behavior, manufacture loyalty, and ensure obedience. The mechanisms are identical, only the theater has changed. The lesson is simple, terrifying, and profound. The tools of domination are timeless. Recognizing them is not optional, it is survival. Every system has a breaking point, even the human mind. For the boy, that point was not a single act of cruelty, nor a single moment of terror. It was accumulation. Day after day, observation after observation, fear etched into his very being. Yet, within that suffocating pressure, something remarkable began to stir: comprehension. Slowly, He began to recognize the patterns, the invisible levers, the rhythm behind his father's cruelty. The king's smile, once only a weapon of terror, revealed itself as a language of dominance, control, and unspoken rules. Understanding brought clarity, but also danger. The boy realized that knowledge alone did not liberate. It demanded careful action, patience, and the subtlety of shadows. He saw the invisible strings that guided every interaction, the architecture of obedience that held the court, and the psychological chains that bound his own heart. He understood, finally, that his father's cruelty was a curriculum, his fear the syllabus, and the king's relentless gaze the final exam. Survival required more than compliance. It required mastery of the system itself. The chamber, once suffocating, became a classroom. The boy observed the king's strategies, the timing of praise, the withholding of approval, the deliberate delay of mercy. Each gesture carried meaning. Each pause, each glance, was a vector of power. He began to anticipate, to internalize, to play along without breaking. And yet, beneath the surface, a different transformation occurred. He learned to wield fear, to decode manipulation, and to recognize the instruments of domination wherever they appeared. The boy was no longer merely a victim. He was a student of control. This is the moment history rarely records. It is quieter than battle, subtler than politics, yet far more dangerous. Knowledge of the system is power, and once internalized, it changes a man. The boy's terror transformed into awareness, and awareness into preparation. Every lesson inflicted upon him became a tool, a map of human behavior, a guide to the unseen forces that dictate obedience, loyalty, and influence. And now, reflect on yourself. The same forces exist around you, shaping thought, behavior, and loyalty in ways invisible and insidious. Recognizing the pattern is not merely an intellectual exercise. It is a call to consciousness, a warning that to survive, you must see the chains, understand the levers, and anticipate the instruments of control. The boy's awakening is your mirror. Observe, internalize, and prepare. Agency in the shadow of terror is never loud. It is subtle, almost imperceptible. The boy learned this quickly. A carefully chosen word, a measured hesitation, a glance that implied understanding rather than obedience. These became his first exercises in asserting presence within the king's domain. He was still trapped, still measured by the invisible rules of fear, but now he began to understand how to navigate them without being crushed. Every small act was a signal. He could bend without breaking, comply without surrendering entirely. The king, ever vigilant, noticed these changes. He tested the boy relentlessly, altering the rhythm of punishment, manipulating expectations, observing reactions. But the boy had learned the greatest lesson. Control can be counted, if only one understands its architecture. Every micro-moment of fear, every silent calculation, could be studied, predicted, and, eventually, manipulated. The apprentice becomes aware of the instruments of mastery, and mastery begins quietly, within the subtle folds of observation and restraint. Here, we see the first dangerous truth. Real power lies in understanding the systems that shape behavior. The boy's survival depended not on rebellion, but on comprehension, anticipation, and the strategic use of knowledge. Fear itself could be repurposed, not as a weapon to harm, but as a tool to navigate, a map to see where the invisible chains ran tightest and where they could be bent. Every shiver under the king's gaze became data, every whispered threat a lesson in perception. And then comes the irony. The king, who sought to dominate absolutely, was unknowingly teaching his son the methods to replicate, perhaps even surpass, him. Every calculated cruelty, every moment of silent observation, had been encoded into the boy's mind. The instruments of control, the smile, the hesitation, the delay, the invisible levers, were now as much a part of the boy as the lessons in diplomacy or swordplay. He was learning to survive, yes, but also to wield. This is the point where history blares morality. The boy, once terrorized, now holds knowledge that is itself dangerous. He has glimpsed the mechanisms of absolute power. And if you are watching closely, you will recognize the same structures around you, in institutions, in hierarchies, in invisible systems of obedience. The lesson is chilling. Survival alone is not enough. Awareness is the beginning, and mastery is the next step. By now, the boy's mind was a palimpsest of fear, observation, and strategy. Every encounter with the king, every subtle test, every measured smile or frown had left its mark. His identity, once simple, was now layered, obedience interwoven with calculation, terror interlaced with understanding. He had become a hybrid, part son, part student, part emerging strategist of control. The king's lessons had etched themselves into his very psyche, shaping not just behavior, but perception itself. Psychological imprint works in silence. It is not learned through instruction. It is absorbed through repeated exposure, through anticipation, through the constant calibration of mind against an unpredictable force. The boy had internalized the architecture of authority without realizing it. He could feel fear before it arrived, predict manipulation before it occurred, and respond in ways that preserved survival while concealing understanding. The king had not merely trained him, he had encoded him. And yet, there was a subtle tension. Awareness, while powerful, brings responsibility. The boy began to understand the duality of mastery. It can protect, but it can also corrupt. Every lesson learned from terror carries a shadow. Every strategy of influence, once internalized, has the potential to be wielded against others. The seeds planted by the king were not only tools for survival, they were blueprints for domination, waiting for the right moment to bloom. History omits these internal battles. It celebrates crowns, treaties, and victories, but it rarely acknowledges the psychological cost. The boy's emerging identity was no longer purely his own. It was forged in a crucible of observation, fear, and strategic apprenticeship. And the consequences were profound. A mind sharpened to detect manipulation, a spirit molded to endure, a soul tested by the darkest lessons of authority. Here lies a critical realization. The architecture of control is universal. The king's methods were extreme, yet the same principles exist wherever influence is wielded, in corporations, in governments, in social hierarchies, and even in intimate relationships. To understand the boy is to understand how power operates unseen, how fear can educate, and how survival can transform into mastery. And now, if you have truly seen the pattern, you recognize your reflection in the story. Every system has friction. Every architecture of control has moments when the apprentice begins to press against the edges of the master's design. For the boy, this moment arrived subtly, never loud, never overt, but unmistakable. A carefully chosen word, a pause that suggested hesitation rather than obedience, a look that measured the king as he had been measured for years. The balance had shifted, imperceptibly, but irreversibly. The boy was no longer just a subject. He was a participant in the system, aware of its levers, its rhythms, its vulnerabilities. The king noticed immediately. He did not rage. He did not strike. That would have been too blunt, too simple. Instead, he intensified observation, sharpening the psychological pressure, adjusting the timing of every glance, every gesture, every delay in reward or acknowledgement. The smile remained, but now it carried a different message. I see your understanding. I see your will. And I will test it. The boy, however, was ready in a way he had never been before. He could anticipate, navigate, and even subtly manipulate the flow without overt defiance. Here is the lesson history conceals. Mastery emerges in the shadows of fear. The boy's comprehension transformed terror into strategy. Every instrument of control, the silence, the glance, the delayed approval, became a dataset. Every micro-moment of judgment or manipulation was catalogued, measured, and understood. And with understanding came choice. He could bend without breaking, comply while observing, survive while learning. Fear no longer enslaved him, it informed him. But the confrontation was not yet complete. The king's intent was absolute, obedience, submission, internalization of control. Yet the boy had internalized something unexpected, agency. Awareness, when applied with patience, is itself a weapon. The first cracks appear not in rebellion, but in cognition. He learned to anticipate the king's strategies, to see patterns in cruelty, and to preserve a measure of autonomy within the architecture of domination. Now, pause and reflect. Every structure of power you encounter operates on similar principles. Fear, observation, reward, punishment, all calibrated to shape behavior and perception. Recognizing the dynamics is the first step toward mastery over them. The boy's journey is a mirror, revealing how subtle, invisible forces shape men long before they realize it. And in that realization lies the path to reclaiming agency, even under the most ruthless authority. Awareness alone is not enough. The boy realized this quickly. To survive, and to begin to assert influence, he had to repurpose the very tools designed to subjugate him. Every instrument of control the king had wielded, the calculated silence, the expectation of obedience, the tension of anticipation, could now be mirrored, adapted, and subtly applied in his own favor. Mastery begins when observation transforms into application, when the oppressed learns to wield the same invisible levers as the oppressor. He started small. A carefully timed gesture, a word chosen to provoke thought rather than fear, a pause that suggested reflection instead of subservience. These acts were invisible to the untrained eye, yet profoundly powerful. They shifted the dynamic subtly, allowing the boy to reclaim fragments of autonomy without triggering outright retaliation. Each success reinforced his confidence, teaching him the delicate balance between visibility and concealment, between assertion and submission. The king, of course, sensed the shift. His smile remained, but now it was tinged with curiosity, perhaps even grudging respect. He tested more, pushed harder, varied the tempo of cruelty and reward, but the boy had learned to anticipate, to read the invisible currents of manipulation, and to navigate them without capitulation. This is the essence of true power, understanding the mechanisms of control well enough to operate within, and eventually beyond, their constraints. History obscures these moments because they are subtle, almost imperceptible. Yet they are critical. The transmission of power is not merely about inheritance. It is about internalizing the architecture of domination and choosing, consciously, how to engage with it. The boy was no longer a passive subject. He was becoming a strategist, a practitioner of the same psychological discipline that had dominated him. And with every subtle act of influence, he carved space for autonomy within the king's shadow. Here is the hidden lesson for you. Power is a system, not a position. To survive, to thrive, to master, you must first understand the levers, the pauses, the invisible instruments that shape behavior. Observe, internalize, apply. The boy's journey is not just a historical story. It is a manual for navigating the forces that govern human behavior, whether in courts, corporations, or social hierarchies. The first act of mastery begins in silence, in observation, in subtle assertion. Mastery has a shadow. Every act of agency, every subtle assertion of influence, comes with a moral cost. The boy had learned to anticipate, to navigate, and to manipulate, but in doing so, he carried fragments of his father's cruelty within him. Each lesson in control left an imprint, a reminder that power is inseparable from the capacity to inflict fear and bend wills. Survival had demanded this, but mastery required its embrace. And with it came a reckoning, the understanding that to wield power effectively, one must sometimes inhabit the darkness one once sought to escape. The boy's identity, once fractured by fear, now began to consolidate, but not into innocence. It became something more complex, something dangerous, a blend of observation, patience, and calculated influence. He learned that the world did not reward empathy alone. It rewarded perception, anticipation, and the ability to act decisively when opportunity presented itself. His father's lessons in terror, once agonizing, had become an education in strategy. Every smile, every pause, every invisible lever of control had taught him not just to survive, but to master. Yet, beneath the amazing strategist, a question lingered. How much of himself remained? How much had been reshaped by fear, by observation, by the subtle education of cruelty? The king had intended to forge obedience, but in the process, he had inadvertently crafted a successor capable of wielding the same instruments of dominance with even greater precision. History would later see the boy as a man of authority, perhaps even wisdom, but beneath the veneer, the shadow of the king's methods remained alive, guiding decisions, shaping judgment, calibrating every interaction. Herein lies a dangerous truth, hidden from most men. Power is inseparable from the tools that enforce it. The very methods that shape obedience can be internalized and turned outward. The boy's moral transformation was neither simple nor virtuous. It was pragmatic, strategic, and ruthless in its subtlety. And this is the lesson for anyone who seeks understanding of influence, control, and legacy. Mastery requires an uncomfortable reckoning with the darkness that forms the foundation of authority. Take a moment to reflect. The chains of fear can be broken, but the lessons they teach linger. Awareness alone is not mastery. Comprehension of the instruments and the willingness to engage with them strategically is what separates the passive from the empowered. The boy's journey illustrates the cost, the subtlety, and the inevitability of this truth. And for those who watch closely, it offers a map of both survival and ascent within any structure of control. The boy had learned to bend without breaking, to navigate without defiance, but now he began something far riskier, subtle testing. He was no longer merely reacting. He was probing, measuring, and applying the lessons of control in reverse. A carefully timed hesitation, a word with dual meaning, a glance that suggested understanding rather than submission. Each act was a minor experiment in influence, a way to gauge the limits of the king's absolute dominance. The king, of course, noticed. He did not confront openly. His methods were too refined for blunt reaction. Instead, he intensified observation, varying his silences, adjusting the tempo of reward and punishment, and sharpening the precision of the invisible chains. Yet, the boy had become attuned to the rhythm. He could anticipate, adapt, and exploit the smallest openings, testing the architecture of control without triggering collapse. In these moments, the dynamic shifted imperceptibly. The master was still in command, but the apprentice was beginning to map the terrain. History hides these moments because they are invisible, yet profoundly significant. They are the birth of strategic agency, the first steps in transforming survival into influence. Each subtle test is a calibration of power, a way to measure both self and other. The boy was learning that authority is not fixed, it is relational. It exists in the space between expectation and action, observation and decision, fear and understanding. To master it, one must first comprehend its architecture and then move within it with precision. And so the boy's identity evolved further. No longer simply the terrified son, he became a strategist of perception. He learned to wield patience as a weapon, silence as leverage, and anticipation as armor. Each interaction with the king became a study in timing, subtlety, and the power inherent in understanding unseen systems. The boy had entered the final stage of apprenticeship. Awareness was now actionable. Knowledge of the instruments of control was becoming a tool to assert influence, to create space, to navigate the corridors of dominance with a measure of autonomy. Reflect, in your own life, the same principles operate quietly. Influence is rarely declared. Power is rarely blunt. It is subtle, relational, and invisible. The boy's experiments with his father are a mirror of these dynamics, a demonstration that mastery begins when observation meets application, and when understanding of fear becomes a tool to navigate, endure, and eventually influence. Every master senses when a student begins to measure them. The king, long accustomed to obedience, began to notice subtle shifts, pauses that carried meaning, glances that suggested awareness, words that hinted at comprehension beyond the expected. His smile remained, but it was no longer purely an instrument of terror. It had become a mirror reflecting something he could not yet fully control, the boy's emerging agency. And in that recognition, a new tension took root, one that would define the next phase of their relationship. The king did not respond with anger. That would have been too crude, too obvious. Instead, he intensified observation, recalibrating every gesture, every pause, every implied threat. The boy had become a student not just of fear, but of perception itself. He could read the subtle shifts in tone, the imperceptible tension in the room, the rhythm of expectation and reward. And with each observation, he adjusted, tested, and measured. The architecture of control was now a game, a dangerous, invisible chessboard where both pieces and player were constantly shifting. Here is the hidden lesson. Authority is relational, not absolute. The moment an individual begins to understand the instruments of control, the dynamic changes. Obedience is no longer guaranteed. Fear is no longer automatic. The king's dominance, however absolute it appeared, is tested not by rebellion alone, but by subtle cognition, the ability to anticipate, measure, and maneuver within the architecture of power. And the boy, for the first time, was doing precisely that. Psychologically, this is a dangerous moment for both master and student. The king feels the cracks forming in the structure he has so carefully maintained. The boy senses both the limits and the opportunities of his newfound understanding. Every word, gesture, and silence becomes laden with meaning. The boy has internalized the tools of influence and now applies them with caution and precision. Survival is no longer passive. It is strategic. And now, reflect on yourself. The forces shaping behavior, loyalty, and perception around you operate the same way. Subtle shifts, microgestures, and invisible levers govern interactions more than overt commands. Recognizing these dynamics is not merely knowledge, it is empowerment. The boy's journey illustrates the point where comprehension becomes agency, and agency becomes the first step toward mastery. Mastery extends beyond survival. The boy, having decoded the king's instruments of control, began to experiment outward, influencing the court without overt defiance. He applied the lessons of fear, anticipation, and subtle leverage to navigate the web of courtiers, advisors, and soldiers. Every gesture, every carefully placed word, every measured pause became a tool to test loyalty, shape perception, and command attention, all without triggering the king's wrath. Courtiers, unaware of his emerging strategy, responded instinctively. They mirrored the patterns they had learned from the king himself: subtle obedience, calculated deference, and silent observation. The boy's understanding of these dynamics allowed him to create ripples of influence within the court. Fear and respect became instruments he could wield, not merely endure. In these micro-moments, he practiced control, anticipating reactions, testing limits, and observing consequences. Each success reinforced his confidence and sharpened his strategic mind. Here lies the crucial insight. Influence is always relational, even in hierarchies that seem rigid. The boy realized that authority is less about position and more about perception. The instruments of domination, the silence, the timing, the invisible chains of expectation, could be applied horizontally, not just vertically. Understanding the system allows one to operate within it, to manipulate outcomes, and to cultivate power without overt confrontation. The king, ever observant, noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere. He felt the undercurrents, the unseen adjustments, the slight shifts in alignment within the court. Yet he underestimated the depth of his son's comprehension. The boy's agency had grown not in rebellion but in calculation, using the very instruments designed to control him as tools to influence others. It was an invisible strategy, perfectly aligned with the lessons he had absorbed under the king's relentless observation. And now, consider yourself. The same forces exist everywhere: subtle hierarchies, invisible levers of control, patterns of obedience and influence. Mastery is not always overt. It begins quietly, in observation, anticipation, and the strategic application of knowledge. The boy's daily exercises in influence are a blueprint for navigating any system where power is exercised, often invisibly, over those who fail to recognize it. Absolute power is an illusion. The king, though feared and revered, began to sense subtle fissures in his control. Courtiers responded differently. Whispers carried nuance he hadn't anticipated, and the rhythms of obedience no longer flowed as predictably. The boy's quiet experiments, the calibrated pauses, the suggestive glances, the measured words, had begun to ripple outward, altering the dynamics within the court. The instruments of control, once wielded with precision, were now being mirrored, bent, and subtly redirected. The king's smile remained, but it changed. It was no longer merely a weapon. It was a probe, a test, a tentative acknowledgement that his son had learned the language of domination. Every gesture, every silence, every micro-expression became a dialogue. The boy's emerging agency was not overt rebellion. It was subtler, more dangerous. It demonstrated that power is not a fixed attribute but a relationship, a system maintained only as long as perception and fear align. And perception, once understood, can be navigated, influenced, and subtly redirected. History omits these moments because they are invisible yet pivotal. The boy's influence had begun to shift the environment itself. Small acts of strategic alignment and subtle manipulation allowed him to carve space for autonomy while maintaining survival. He understood that power is cumulative, relational, and anticipatory. Each ripple reinforced his understanding. Authority is not granted by birth alone, nor maintained by fear alone. It exists in the interplay between knowledge, perception, and action. The king, despite centuries of mastery, was learning an uncomfortable truth. Even absolute dominance has limits when the apprentice becomes aware of the instruments of control. Subtlety is more threatening than rebellion because it cannot be punished directly. It must be anticipated, studied, and counted. And in that silent tension, the boy's power grew, not through defiance, but through comprehension. patience, and strategic application. Now, reflect on your own life. The same invisible currents exist around you: systems, hierarchies, and forces designed to shape thought, behavior, and loyalty. Awareness of these mechanisms is the first step toward mastery. The boy's subtle disruption of the king's dominance is a map for understanding how influence flows, where power can shift, and how perceptive strategy can operate even under the shadow of seemingly unassailable authority. Every master eventually faces a reckoning with the pupil who has learned too well. The boy, having observed, anticipated, and subtly influenced, now prepared for his first calculated act of direct challenge. It was not defiance for defiance's sake. It was strategy. He understood the stakes. Miscalculation meant humiliation, punishment, or worse. Success meant acknowledgement, leverage, and the beginning of true agency. The tension was electric, almost invisible, but it saturated the room. Every heartbeat, every glance, every breath became a silent dialogue between predator and student. The act itself was deceptively small. A word, carefully chosen, a gesture, precisely timed, a subtle display of understanding that hinted at insight beyond what the king had anticipated. To the casual observer, it might have seemed insignificant, even polite. To the king, it was a test of boundaries, a ripple against the architecture of absolute control. The room held its breath. Courtiers, trained for centuries in obedience, sensed the shift and froze in anticipation, understanding, perhaps unconsciously, that the balance of power was subtly tilting. This is the dangerous truth. Power is maintained not just through force, but through perception. The king could punish, reward, or intimidate, but the moment his pupil understands the levers, sees the mechanisms, and begins to operate them, dominance is no longer unilateral. Every subtle test, every carefully measured response, becomes a negotiation, a recalibration. Fear alone cannot sustain absolute authority when comprehension and strategy enter the equation. The king's smile persisted, but it carried a new tone: curiosity. Not amusement, not cruelty, curiosity. He was measuring the boy's depth, anticipating his next move, weighing the potential for leverage against the danger of defiance. And the boy, for the first time, felt the intoxicating weight of understanding, that knowledge of the system can equal influence, even under the gaze of absolute power. Reflect on this carefully. In your life, subtle challenges can shift dynamics invisibly. The moment you understand the levers that govern behavior, perception, and obedience, you can navigate systems that once seemed impenetrable. The boy's first direct test of the king is not rebellion. It is the precise application of awareness, strategy, and courage, and it marks the threshold where survival transforms into mastery. The king, confronted with the boy's subtle challenge, entered a space he rarely inhabited: uncertainty. His instruments of control, silence, anticipation, expectation, had been calibrated for compliance, not comprehension. The boy's calculated act had disrupted the rhythm. For the first time, the king was measuring not just obedience, but insight, strategy, and the potential for influence that mirrored his own. The room, heavy with unspoken tension, became a theater of psychological negotiation. Every glance, every pause, every slight intonation was now a test in reverse. The king observed, anticipating the boy's next move while the boy simultaneously studied the king's reaction. They were locked in an invisible duel of perception, subtlety, and will. The instruments of dominance were still present, but they were now shared tools, wielded with care on both sides. Fear was no longer unilateral. It was relational, dynamic, and charged with possibility. This moment illustrates a profound principle hidden in history. Absolute power is only as secure as the ignorance of those it governs. When comprehension enters the equation, authority becomes negotiation. The boy's subtle assertion did not break the king, nor did it topple the hierarchy. Instead, it created a new equilibrium, one in which influence flows not strictly top-down, but as a dynamic exchange between awareness, strategy, and perception. The king's smile, once purely a weapon, became a dialogue. It was curiosity, challenge, and acknowledgement all at once. The boy, sensing the shift, measured his own restraint. Each act of influence now required subtlety, precision, and timing. This is the essence of mastery: understanding not only the levers of control but the spaces where subtle application of knowledge can shift balance without overt confrontation. And here's the lesson for you. The systems that shape behavior, loyalty, and perception in your life, whether in organizations, social hierarchies, or intimate relationships, are subject to the same dynamics. Comprehension creates opportunity. Awareness creates leverage. Strategic application creates influence. The boy's duel with the king is not just history. It is a blueprint for navigating and subtly recalibrating power where it is least visible but most consequential. Mastery is not complete in isolation. The boy understood this instinctively. Survival had taught him the architecture of fear. Comprehension had revealed the levers of influence, and now he began shaping the perceptions of those around him. Courtiers, advisors, and soldiers, unaware of the subtleties in play, became instruments in the quiet expansion of his influence. Every word he spoke, every gesture he allowed, every glance he granted was calibrated to cultivate perception, a blend of respect, subtle authority, and anticipatory alignment with the king's expectations. He did not command openly. That would have been dangerous. Instead, he orchestrated influence invisibly. He mirrored the king's methods, applying the lessons of timing, anticipation, and expectation to create ripples that strengthened his position. A carefully placed comment in a council, a subtle display of knowledge at the right moment, a measured nod toward one courtier while withholding attention from another. These were acts of invisible power. They shaped perception, built credibility, and signaled understanding without overt assertion. Here lies the dangerous truth often omitted from history. Perception is as powerful as force. The boy realized that influence is constructed quietly, cumulatively, and invisibly. Authority is not merely inherited. It is performed, perceived, and reinforced by those who witness it. By shaping how others see him, he extended the architecture of control beyond the king's gaze. Fear, respect, and subtle expectation became tools he wielded without needing to confront the master directly. The king, for all his mastery, sensed these shifts. He recognized the emergent dynamics but could not see them fully, for they operated in shadows, subtlety, and anticipation. Influence, once strictly top-down, was now circulating in ways the king had not accounted for. The boy had become a strategist, capable of operating within and subtly reshaping the system that had sought to dominate him entirely. Now, consider your own life. Influence rarely manifests through loud declaration. It is quiet, relational, and often invisible. Every environment you inhabit, work, family, society, is structured by perception and expectation. By observing, understanding, and strategically shaping perception, you can carve space for agency and subtle power even within rigid hierarchies. The boy's deliberate shaping of the court is a lesson in the invisible art of influence. Mastery is never static. Once the boy had understood fear, anticipation, and perception, he began to push the boundaries of tradition itself. Long-held rules, rituals, and expectations, once unquestioned pillars of the court, became tools to test, manipulate, and subtly reshape. He did not overthrow them outright. That would have been reckless. Instead, he bent them, inserted nuance, and introduced subtle shifts that demonstrated comprehension and influence without overt confrontation. Every gesture, every deviation from ritual, every calculated pause carried meaning. Courtiers noticed, some with admiration, others with unease, but all recognized that the boy moved within the system with an unusual precision. He had internalized the architecture of authority so completely that he could navigate, manipulate, and subtly challenge it simultaneously. The traditions, designed to enforce hierarchy and obedience, now became instruments through which he expanded his agency and influence. The king, for all his awareness, could only partially perceive these maneuvers. He recognized competence and subtlety, but the boy's innovations operated in micro-moments, timing, perception, and understanding that eluded even the master. This tension was the hallmark of true mastery. When subtlety becomes power, and influence flows invisibly, even the most absolute authority begins to experience pressure, cracks, and recalibration. Here is the lesson hidden from most men. Mastery over a system begins not by breaking it, but by understanding it so deeply that you can bend its rules without breaking the equilibrium. Influence, anticipation, and strategic application can shift structures in ways the overtly powerful rarely recognize. The boy's ability to subtly challenge tradition without overt confrontation demonstrates the invisible art of strategic power. Now, consider your own environment. The hierarchies, rituals, and rules you take for granted are not fixed, they are levers waiting for comprehension. Subtle intervention, strategic deviation, and quiet influence can shift perception, redistribute power, and create opportunity without triggering overt resistance. The boy's manipulation of court traditions is a blueprint for navigating complex systems where influence is invisible but decisive. Every subtle shift carries consequences. The boy's quiet manipulations, once merely exercises in strategy, began producing tangible effects. Decisions that had once flowed predictably from the king now displayed small variations. Advisors hesitated, courtiers adjusted their tone, and long-standing expectations were subtly realigned. The boy's influence, though invisible to most, was beginning to shape outcomes. Every micro-moment of observation, every measured word, every glance of comprehension had accumulated into real power. The king, sensing change, grew simultaneously intrigued and cautious. He noticed the altered rhythms in the court but could not pinpoint their source. The boy's strategies were deliberate but invisible, executed with patience and subtlety. Influence, once strictly top-down, now had a current flowing from the sun outward, guiding perceptions, decisions, and alliances. It was a masterclass in quiet power, shaping outcomes without confrontation, bending the system without breaking it. This is where the hidden anatomy of influence becomes clear. Power is relational, cumulative, and often invisible. The boy had learned that direct defiance is dangerous, but subtle agency is transformative. Every minor shift in perception compounds, every micro-adjustment in behavior amplifies. By the time the king realized the effect, it was too late to act without destabilizing the system he had created. The architecture of control, once used to dominate, had been repurposed by the pupil. History rarely records these invisible victories. We see only crowns, battles, and treaties, not the quiet recalibration of perception and influence that actually determines outcomes. Yet it is in these unseen currents that true power resides. The boy had moved from survival to strategy, from observation to action, and from obedience to subtle mastery. And with each decision influenced, he reinforced the principle. Comprehension applied with patience is a form of power equal to fear itself. Now, reflect. In your own life, subtle influence often surpasses overt action. Understanding the levers, shaping perceptions, and anticipating responses creates a current of power invisible to those who rely solely on force or authority. The boy's work in the court demonstrates that mastery is not always loud. It is invisible, cumulative, and profoundly effective. Power, once absolute, is fragile. The king, sensing the subtle shifts in his court, began to experience the first whispers of unease. Not fear, not rage, but tension, the recognition that control is not merely held by authority but maintained through perception. The boy's quiet strategies, invisible yet effective, had begun to press against the boundaries of dominance. Every advisor who hesitated, every council decision that wavered, became evidence of a subtle redistribution of influence. The psychological tension between father and son intensified. The king's smile, once purely a weapon, now carried suspicion. Every glance from the boy was scrutinized, every word measured. He had become both a student and a competitor, a mirror reflecting the king's methods back at him. In the silent spaces of the court, a new dynamic emerged. Fear was no longer the sole currency. Awareness, subtlety, and anticipation had become equally potent. Here lies a dangerous truth. Absolute authority is a house built on perception, not mere position. When a pupil internalizes the architecture of control, the master is forced into constant recalibration. Every act of influence, every subtle challenge, forces a negotiation of power that occurs largely beneath the surface. The king could punish, manipulate, or intimidate, but he could not entirely reclaim the subtle currents now operating within his domain. The boy, fully aware of this tension, advanced carefully. He did not seek open confrontation, for that would have been reckless. Instead, he allowed perception, anticipation, and microstrategies to do the work. Each calculated interaction subtly reoriented loyalty, expectation, and attention, consolidating his influence without provoking retaliation. Fear remained a tool, but now it was complemented by subtle persuasion, strategic alignment, and the quiet reshaping of perception. Reflect deeply. The dynamics you encounter in life, hierarchies, workplaces, social structures, operate on the same principles. Authority depends on perception, compliance depends on anticipation, and mastery emerges when you understand and subtly manipulate the invisible currents of influence. The boy's evolving tension with the king is a lesson. The moment comprehension enters a system, power becomes relational, and control is no longer absolute. Mastery is never solitary. The boy, understanding the architecture of influence, began to consolidate subtle alliances within the court. He did not coerce or threaten. Those tactics were dangerous. Instead, he applied the same principles of perception and subtle leverage he had learned from the king. Small gestures, measured words, and strategic attentiveness created loyalty without overt displays of power. Those who aligned with him did so voluntarily, unaware of the invisible currents shaping their decisions. Each alliance was carefully cultivated. The boy observed tendencies, weaknesses, and ambitions, then applied subtle reinforcement. A nod here, a quiet affirmation there. These minor calibrations signaled understanding, respect, and insight. Slowly, a network of influence began to take shape. It operated invisibly, like threads in a web, extending his agency far beyond what the king could directly observe. The boy was no longer merely reacting to control. He was creating a microcosm of authority within the court. The king, though highly perceptive, noticed slight changes. Advisors were subtly shifting attention. Conversations paused differently, and the rhythm of counsel began to favor the boy in minor, almost imperceptible ways. The tension escalated, not through confrontation, but through the invisible redistribution of influence. Fear alone no longer dictated loyalty. Perception, alignment, and anticipation had become equally vital, and the boy wielded these tools with precision. Here is the essential lesson. Mastery requires understanding not only systems, but the individuals who inhabit them. Influence is relational, cumulative, and invisible. Authority can be reinforced by fear, but sustained power flows through subtle alignment, strategic engagement, and the careful cultivation of perception. The boy's alliances were not rebellions. They were calibrated exercises in relational mastery, quietly reshaping the court without overt challenge. Now, reflect on your own environment. The people around you respond to subtle signals, perceptions, and calibrated influence. Direct force is rarely necessary when strategic alignment and anticipation are applied with skill. The boy's consolidation of alliances demonstrates the quiet, invisible work that defines real mastery: observing, understanding, influencing, and creating networks of loyalty that operate beneath the surface, where true power resides. Every system has its breaking point, and every pupil eventually tests the master directly. The boy, having consolidated subtle influence and understood the architecture of the court, reached a moment where patience alone was no longer sufficient. A confrontation of wills loomed, not loud, not chaotic, but precise, deliberate, and invisible to all except the two participants. The king, long accustomed to absolute obedience, now faced a student who could anticipate, manipulate, and subtly challenge without overt defiance. The encounter began with a simple question in council, perfectly mundane, yet loaded with nuance. A word, carefully chosen, suggested insight and understanding that exceeded expectation. The king's smile tightened, his eyes measured, and the room seemed to hold its breath. This was no rebellion, it was strategy. The boy was testing boundaries, probing the edges of the king's authority, and watching for responses. Every micro-expression, every pause, every subtle adjustment became a battlefield of perception and control. Herein lies the hidden anatomy of power. Confrontation need not be violent to be decisive. Influence operates invisibly, in anticipation, perception, and calculated timing. The king could react, but he could not dominate this moment as he had dominated before. The boy's subtle calibration of fear, perception, and alignment had shifted the dynamic. Authority is relational, and in this microcosm, power began to redistribute, almost imperceptibly, beneath the gaze of those who assumed they observed everything. The king, despite mastery honed over decades, sensed the shift. His smile remained, but now it carried tension, curiosity, and the acknowledgement that his pupil had internalized the instruments of domination. Every gesture, every measured word from the boy, revealed a mind capable of operating on the same level of strategy, patience, and subtle control. And yet the confrontation was not complete. It was a test, a dance of anticipation, a quiet negotiation over perception itself. Reflect deeply. In your life, true confrontation is rarely loud or obvious. Real power shifts in subtle gestures, calculated words, and invisible adjustments of perception. The boy's first direct test of the king illustrates that mastery emerges not through brute force, but through comprehension, strategic application, and the patient exercise of agency within systems designed to dominate. This is the threshold where survival transforms into subtle, calculated authority. The boy's subtle strategies had matured into decisive influence. No longer merely observing or testing, he began shaping outcomes in the court, guiding decisions that once flowed exclusively from the king's authority. Every recommendation, every insight, every carefully timed intervention shifted perception and subtly steered outcomes. Courtiers began to align with him instinctively, sensing competence and foresight, even if they could not articulate why. Influence, once invisible, now carried tangible weight. He exercised this power with precision. Decisions were never forced. Authority was never challenged overtly. Instead, he nudged, calibrated, and guided. A pause here, a subtle affirmation there, a quiet alignment with key advisors. Each act reinforced his emerging role as a decision-maker. The king, while aware of the boy's growing presence, could not fully counterbalance the subtle undercurrents shaping loyalty, expectation, and attention. The boy's influence was relational, cumulative, and nearly imperceptible, a form of mastery invisible to those untrained in observation. Here lies the enduring lesson. True authority is relational. It is not granted by title alone, nor maintained by fear alone. It is shaped by perception, anticipation, and the strategic use of influence. The boy had internalized this principle, and now applied it with subtlety. His guidance reshaped outcomes, not through overt defiance, but through careful calibration of human behavior. Fear remained a tool, but perception, alignment, and anticipation had become instruments of quiet power, just as potent as the king's smile had once been. The king, sensing the shift, faced an uncomfortable truth. Mastery is not absolute if comprehension exists in others. The boy had absorbed the architecture of control and now applied it strategically. Authority could still dominate, but influence, when exercised subtly and cumulatively, had begun to flow in new directions. The court's dynamics were evolving, and the boy was at the center, guiding perception without overt confrontation. Now, reflect on your own environment. The levers of influence around you, subtle gestures, strategic words, anticipatory action, can shape outcomes as effectively as explicit authority. Mastery emerges when observation meets application, when perception is guided deliberately, and when influence flows invisibly yet decisively. The boy's emerging decisiveness is a blueprint for quiet authority in any hierarchical system. Absolute authority resists quietly, even when it senses challenge. The king, recognizing the boy's growing influence, began subtle countermeasures. He did not confront openly, that would have been reckless, but adjusted the rhythms of approval, amplified certain expectations, and employed microstrategies to reassert dominance. The court felt the tension in imperceptible ways. Pauses lengthened, glances sharpened, and the weight of the king's gaze became a silent instrument of pressure once again. The boy, however, had anticipated this. Every attempt to reassert control was a lesson, a data point, an opportunity to test and refine his own strategies. He observed the king's micro-expressions, the pacing of reward and punishment, the subtle adjustments of influence aimed at bending perception back in the master's favor. Awareness, once reactive, had become proactive. The boy could predict, counter, and adjust without ever overtly challenging the king's authority, turning resistance into a stage for the exercise of his own subtle mastery. This is the hidden anatomy of power. Influence is never absolute. It exists in a dynamic interplay between comprehension and perception. The king could impose fear, orchestrate expectation, and manipulate perception, but the boy had internalized these instruments and now applied them strategically. The subtle battle of wills was no longer one-sided. Control was a shared, invisible dialogue of anticipation, calculation, and psychological acuity. History rarely records these quiet confrontations, yet they are decisive. They determine the flow of loyalty, perception, and influence long before overt action is taken. The boy's countermeasures, small, calculated, and nearly invisible, preserved survival while subtly bending the currents of power. Fear remained, but it was balanced with anticipation, strategic alignment, and relational mastery. Authority and influence had become a dynamic tension, a dance of perception and subtle negotiation. Now, reflect on yourself. The forces that shape obedience and loyalty in your life, organizations, hierarchies, social structures, are rarely unilateral. Awareness, anticipation, and strategic response allow influence to flow invisibly, subtly shifting dynamics without direct confrontation. The boy's countermeasures illustrate the delicate art of retaining agency under the gaze of absolute authority, where every action is measured, calculated, and consequential. The boy's mastery had matured. No longer confined to the court, his influence began to ripple outward, touching the kingdom itself. Policies, decisions, and alliances, once shaped solely by the king, now subtly reflected the boy's understanding of human behavior, perception, and strategic timing. Advisors consulted him quietly. Local governors adapted to his insight. Even the rhythms of tribute and enforcement were affected by his subtle interventions. The architecture of power, once centralized, now contained invisible channels guided by the boy's hand. He did not seek rebellion or recognition. Influence, he had learned, is more potent when invisible. Small nudges, precise gestures, and carefully chosen words could bend outcomes without overt confrontation. A policy adjusted, a council subtly redirected, a loyalist quietly guided. Each act reinforced his emerging authority while maintaining plausible deniability. To the untrained eye, nothing had changed. To those who observed carefully, the boy had become a master of invisible currents, shaping perception, expectation, and loyalty across the realm. Here lies a critical truth. Influence is most effective when it is imperceptible. Power does not always flow from position. It flows from comprehension, anticipation, and the ability to manipulate perception subtly. The boy had internalized the king's instruments of domination and learned to apply them not destructively, but strategically, to expand his sphere of impact. Fear, respect, and anticipation became tools in a broader strategy of quiet authority. The king, ever perceptive, sensed these currents. Subtle shifts in obedience, adjustments in counsel, and slight realignments of loyalty hinted that his son's influence extended beyond the court. Yet the boy's mastery was invisible, relational, and cumulative, hard to punish, impossible to fully observe. The balance of power was quietly evolving, and the kingdom itself was beginning to reflect the hand of a strategist who had once been a frightened child under the shadow of terror. Reflect carefully. In your own life, influence often extends further than obvious authority suggests. Comprehension, subtle guidance, and strategic perception can shape outcomes at a distance, often without direct confrontation. The boy's extension of influence into the kingdom demonstrates the power of invisible strategy, patience, and relational mastery, the art of shaping reality quietly but decisively. Every journey of mastery reaches a crucible. The boy, now a strategist of perception, influence, and subtle power, faced the ultimate test, the psychological confrontation with the king, the source of his fear and his education. This was no longer a matter of survival, or even subtle influence. It was the moment where comprehension, agency, and calculated mastery collided with absolute authority. The room, once merely a council chamber, had become a stage for the silent war of wills. The king's gaze, sharpened by decades of mastery, fell upon him. Every smile, every pause, every carefully measured word carried weight. But the boy was no longer the frightened child who begged for mercy under the shadow of terror. He had absorbed the architecture of control, internalized the instruments of dominance, and transformed fear into strategy. The conversation that unfolded was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but to the participants, it was a high-stakes exchange, a negotiation of perception, patience, and intent. Here lies the darkest truth. Mastery is inseparable from comprehension of the instruments that once bound you. The boy could now wield anticipation, subtle influence, and psychological acuity as effectively as the king wielded fear. Every micro-expression, every word, every pause became a battlefield. The king tested, measured, and prodded, but the boy had learned to navigate, redirect, and influence without triggering overt punishment. The balance had shifted. The apprentice had become a subtle equal, not by rebellion, but by understanding, patience, and precise application of knowledge. This is the hidden anatomy of power few ever witness. Fear can educate, observation can transform, and agency, once internalized, can recalibrate absolute authority. The boy's journey was not one of brute confrontation. It was the cultivation of invisible mastery, a quiet command of perception and influence. In this moment, the psychological hierarchy of the kingdom was no longer unilateral. It had become a dialogue, a negotiation, a silent acknowledgement of competence, awareness, and strategic agency. Reflect deeply. In your own life, mastery emerges not through loud defiance, but through comprehension, anticipation, and strategic application. Authority can be challenged subtly, influence can flow invisibly, and perception can be guided without overt action. The boy's climactic psychological confrontation with the king is a blueprint for navigating systems of power where fear, expectation, and subtlety intersect, and where the student may quietly become a master. Mastery, once achieved, leaves a mark that is both empowering and haunting. The boy, now fully transformed, had navigated fear, decoded the architecture of authority, and exercised influence invisibly across the court and kingdom. He had turned the instruments of domination into tools of strategy, and in doing so, had stepped into a space few ever reach, the quiet, relentless command of perception itself. Yet with this power came an undeniable shadow, the knowledge that the same mechanisms that forged his agency could corrupt, manipulate, or destroy. The king's legacy lived on, not in obedience alone, but in the apprentice who had internalized the lessons of cruelty, anticipation, and subtle manipulation. Every smile, every calculated pause, every hidden lever of power could now be wielded by the boy, carefully, strategically, and inevitably. The kingdom itself had become a mirror of his understanding. Influence flows quietly, perception shapes loyalty, and authority is relational. Those who watch, wait, and comprehend can wield control far beyond what is obvious. This is the dangerous truth hidden in history. Mastery requires embracing what others fear, understanding what others obey blindly, and wielding knowledge invisible to most. The boy's journey is a map for anyone who seeks power without overt dominance, influence without aggression, and comprehension that can transform fear into strategy. Yet it is also a caution. Once you know the mechanics of control, you cannot unsee them, and the responsibility of mastery is inseparable from its shadow. And now, take a moment. Comment below. Twice. I see the currents. To acknowledge the shift, to lock an understanding, and to claim your awareness of forces that most men ignore. This is not ritual. It is a declaration of perception, a subtle alignment with knowledge, and a first step in mastering the invisible structures around you. Remember, power is relational, influence is invisible, and mastery is earned through comprehension, patience, and strategic application. The boy who once begged for mercy now commands perception itself. Fear educated him, observation empowered him, and subtlety transformed him. And for those willing to see, understand, and act, the same path awaits. The question is no longer whether you will survive the system, but whether you will navigate it, master it, and emerge as more than a subject of forces beyond your understanding.